So somebody keep their eye on the clock. At about 10 minutes past 11, just let me know. And we will finish what we need to do. So as Cody already pointed out, a lot of the things on this unit we kind of covered in the first unit. But this unit specifically, where the first unit really wasn't a unit. With the AP book and AP stuff, it's units. Some people call it unit 0. It's kind of just introduction stuff. And but yeah, so this is the unit we're really going to just cover and go into it and talk a little bit about tragedy commons. And I like this picture because I had goat butts, so I kept it up there. So yeah, everybody remember tragedy commons? What was our example we used? What did we do? Yeah, the cows in the field and the farmer. So one person making a decision that makes sense to them, but then if everybody made that same rational decision, it becomes very, very irrational for the entire population. One thing I was reading about tragedy of the commons said that it's why public bathrooms are gross. It's tragedy of the commons. Because it makes perfect sense since you're not going to come back to this bathroom to maybe leave it a little dirty. And then, since it's a common good for other people to use, then the public restroom stays dirty. So I thought that was kind of an interesting human aspect of tragedy of the commons. Okay, I'm going to cut lights off so we can see better and so Jocelyn can get a nice nap. So yeah, tragedy commons, it's all about sharing public resources, but when they do things for their own self-interest, it can degrade them for other folks. Must be a public interest, not privately owned. So there's no tragedy of the commons for mowing your grass. Okay, you can change the ecosystem, you can do things, but there's no tragedy of commons for just mowing your grass, things like that. And it must be degraded, overused, or depleted, or used up in some way. The biggest picture example of tragedy of the commons for our planet is the air, the atmosphere, because even though we like to think that we own the air around us, the air around us doesn't know to stay there. And so how we affect the air around us and the air in our state and the air in our country affects the air in the entire world. And that's why you need giant global solutions to these problems, because we have this shared air. So other examples, overgrazing and overfishing, and then water and air pollution we kind of already mentioned. And then overuse of groundwater. This is big in places like in the Rust Belt areas, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, these states, since industry left 40, 30, 50 years ago, one of the big solutions to come back is supplying water. If you buy any type of bottled water, I pretty much guarantee you, it does tell you, some don't tell you the bottling place at all, but if it does tell you where it was bottled, I would bet it's either in Michigan or Pennsylvania. Most places where we have, you look at bottled water, it comes from Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of these states set this up to bring industry back. So you let Nestle, which is your biggest bottled drinking water company in the United States. Anybody, did you know that? What do you think of when you think of Nestle? Yeah, but Nestle is the biggest bottled water producer in the United States. Anybody know what you would buy at the store if you were paying Nestle? Every once in a while you'll see a bottle that's just straight up says Nestle. No, Dasani's Coke. Dasani's Coke, Aquafina's Pepsi, Nestle is Deer Park. Deer Park and lots of other brands. It's like Avion Springs, all of those brands are this one big company, Nestle. And places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, they give tax breaks to these companies to bring in these things. And then they say, set up this plant. And once you buy a piece of land, in many places, in most places in the United States, what are the rules about pumping water off of your land? Exactly. You own the groundwater underneath your feet. And so most places in our country, If you buy the land, you can pump as much water as you want to. Now, does the groundwater know to stay under your feet? So if I pump groundwater from my giant plant and you live a mile away in a neighborhood, what might that mean for your well? Yeah, it's going to run dry. It could cause salinization of your soils, which because you're lowering that water table and things like that, and so you end up with this tragedy of the common situation like this. And if you didn't get the vibe from me already, I'm not a big fan of bottled water, and we might hit that a little bit later as well. You know, there's a lot of things that we do that are bad for the environment that, you know, you just do because they're convenient. There's not any other way around it. Bottled water, there's freaking no use whatsoever in the world. The water out of your tap is more regulated and safer than anything that's in a bottle that you can buy at the store, unless you live in a place that has dangerous water, which none of us do. All right, so why does it happen? When nobody owns the resource or directly suffers from the consequences, then they assume that if they overuse it, then it won't make a big difference. And then a lot of times there's no penalty for it. So you have to get these agreements that work in, okay? And the little cartoon here says, well, there it is, the last fish in the ocean. And the other guy says, woohoo, at least we beat the Russians and Spaniards to it. I mean, obviously kind of silly, but there's a lot of corporate truth to that. Since this is a resource that there's only a little bit out there, I'm going to beat everybody to it. I'm going to make the most money off of it. Oil is a big thing about this. If you've never seen the movie There Will Be Blood, it is a very hard to watch movie. It is a very kind of artsy movie, but the oil story behind it is very real. One of the culminating scenes of the movie is the main bad guy character, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, does this thing where he says, I buy this land beside your land and I start pumping harder and faster than you, and I have a longer straw, so I drink up your milkshake. And that's the tragedy of the commons. But yeah, watch that movie, it's good stuff. But yeah, could be problems as well. So what's the problem in tragedy of commons? Once again, we talked about overfishing. We talked about, you know, the complete drop off in fish stocks all over the world because of this. And then air pollution, you know, where a lot of times the problem with air pollution is that you polluting your air does not affect your area. It affects somewhere else. And so California has terrible air pollution, but a lot of it really isn't because of California. A lot of it's because of China. And so you end up with this situation where you don't even get to see any of the results. Pesticide runoff from farms can go into our aquifers, can go into our lakes and rivers and streams. And the pesticides help the plants grow, help us be able to buy vegetables cheap at the grocery store. But then, you know, what does it do to our other ecosystems, and how does it affect other industries? An externality is something that you'll hear a lot when you start talking about this type of thing. And an externality is pretty much just a negative cost associated with human actions that aren't accounted for in the price. We talked about this before, paying $1 for a McChicken sandwich. Paying $1 for a McChicken sandwich is great, and I do it all the time. The thing about it is, it also comes with externalities. It comes with what these companies are doing with their chicken processing plants and what they're doing to the environment, and how they're able to create it in such a way that it only costs $1. So you might be paying $1, but the externalities are there and really affect the whole ecosystem. So what do we do to fix it? So one solution is to not have public land. You know, that can be kind of sketchy, but you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It could be government owned. And the thing about government owned is it's still public owned, but it's public owned with rules. And so you end up with creating those rules around that. Fees and taxes for use, permit system. This is why you have all kinds of rules. They figured this out when it comes to the North Carolina Wildlife Association. When you buy, you know, You buy tags to hunt certain things. You can only get so many fish. You have a limit for different fish you can get. They have a certain size they have to be. Whatever you're hunting, most species have bag limits that you can only get so many in a season. Whereas some species do not have bag limits because they're invasive and you want to try to get as many of them as you can away. For example, we talked about nutria earlier in the year. Nutria that you can shoot and kill as many nutria as you want in North Carolina legally. And I want to say raccoons also don't have bag limits as well. I've seen the list before of different limits in North Carolina. But having limits, having permit systems. If you go, especially in western parts of the country, you actually will buy a permit to kill a specific animal. Like if you want to hunt a specific animal, it costs you money to go and hunt that specific animal, and you get to kill one, and that's it. And so you got all kinds of things like that. Criminal charges for pollution for shared air. This is where you have to get those things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act, the huge green movement of the 70s in the Nixon administration, which is hard for us to believe. But that's where this came out of. That you had certain rivers that were running red with pollutants. And so the government got together and said, hey, we're going to start fining you for putting this stuff out there. All right, and then you get BLM, which we talked about before as well, the Bureau of Land Management, which is a lot of huge chunks of land in the western part of our country, especially, are BLM land owned by the government, and you have to have certain procedures and you have to follow certain rules to be able to use that land. And the rangelands, especially in the western United States, and that was really in the news a couple of years ago with the Bundy family wanting to graze their cattle in a certain area where there was a protected tortoise, and they couldn't do it, and they were upset about it, and they said, well, come pry my cattle from my cold dead hands type thing. And they had a standoff, and it's a really interesting story if you want to look into it. But it's not just people versus the government, it's the people versus the government for the good of all the people. Questions on tragedy of the commons? We talked about it before, that's why I'm kind of rolling past it. Okay, next up is clear cutting. Pretty straightforward idea. It's where you go into woods, cut down all the trees. We see this in Eastern North Carolina quite a bit. You'll drive by an area where there used to be a forest, an old growth forest, and it seems like almost overnight, over a weekend, a company will come in and pay for the rights to cut down all the trees and take them and make paper or whatever out of them. So clear cutting is definitely something we see around here. So some direct effects of cutting down all the trees. You're going to lose what the trees are doing for you. You have these jobs that trees are doing for you that just go away when you cut them down. The stabilizing root structure, so you get erosion. Your land gets washed away. One of the first things that people do, my parents live on Blunt's Creek or Blunt's Bay on the Pamlico River. People buy a new piece of land on the river. Well, the first thing they do is cut all the trees down so they can build a house. What did they just do? What's a problem with doing that? Go ahead. Well, they can create flooding, but they can also straight up lose the land they just bought. One of the things that people fight when they buy riverfront property is keeping their property. And so fighting that erosion, I hate to break it to you, whether you live on the Pamlico River or on the Atlantic Ocean or the Pamlico Sound, if you're fighting the erosion of the water, you're going to lose. And one of the only things that are going to keep that from happening are your trees. You take those trees out and you're just letting that happen. It's going to help recycle the organic matter, the nutrients. It puts all kinds of, it lets that sediments go into local streams. One of the trick questions they always love to ask on the AP test is, what is the most common pollutant in freshwater rivers? The answer is soil, particles, dirt, because of this erosion from cutting down trees and things like that. So it makes the water warm, makes it more cloudy, completely changes the ecosystem. So you see this is a stream here. This looks a lot like the trees, not so much because this looks more like a coniferous forest, but the way that the stream is moving looks a lot like the Continia Creek or Trainer's Creek up north of the Tar River. But those winding streams that we get here in East North Carolina as the land flattens out. You also are going to increase your temperature. Increased temperature is going to change. You get rid of the shade. Soil has lower albedo. That means it reflects less stuff. It's going to absorb more heat. Absorb more heat changes the ecosystem. It's not just about global warming. It's not just about you're making the whole planet warmer. It's about specific spots individually. You get these certain species that seek out a certain temperature, and you change the temperature, they stop seeking it out, and you change the entire food web. Another problem, like Owen said, was flooding. You know, you take this soil that's really aerated and can hold a lot of water, compact it down, and now the water's got to go somewhere. It sits on top. And the water, you're creating a situation where you create more flooding. I've already mentioned this about Grifton. Have we looked at the map in Grifton? I can't remember, my classes run together. We haven't looked at the map in Grifton yet? Okay, let's do that real quick then. Because in my opinion, I mean, I was only 18 or 19 years old, but in my opinion, one of the dumbest things ever to have been done by a local community was what Grifton did after the 1999 flood. All right, so here you have Grifton. We'll zoom on in so we can really see what's going on. And I'm gonna get rid of the labels. Where's my labels at? That's not worth it. Okay. All right, so this is the Continia Creek. Zoom out just a little bit. Continia Creek is this, like I said, slow winding creek. And Grifton is a community we've mentioned before in this class where people on some level have been living in Grifton for 1,000 years or more. Okay, Ayton people have only been living for 100, 150 years. In Grifton, people have been living for thousands of years because of this terrestrial landscape, because of this ability to have a community right here in the crook of this creek that allows for irrigation of your crops, that allows for transportation up and down the creek, that allows for easy transportation all the way out to the Neuse River and eventually out to New Bern. You can really communicate with lots of areas. We think of Grifton as this tiny little town, but if you take away the roads, Grifton is a really well situated community for getting all over Eastern North Carolina, whether you need to hunt or fish or do anything to keep your community afloat. Now, this was good for the First Nations peoples who lived here, 400, 500, 600 years ago, because of this, all of those things I just listed. Not so good for building a community, because the problem is what they did to these creeks, both here and upstream. If you follow the Continia Creek, you eventually hit Wilson. Zoom on out here. But you eventually hit Wilson on the Continia Creek, and you hit these areas that are reservoirs. Where's it at? Right in, there's one. That's a little one. But you hit these reservoir areas on the creek like this. There's about 3 in Wilson. And if you go further, there's even more. And it was a way for people to control flooding. So you didn't want your crops to flood back and forth all the time. And so what you did was you made it so instead of a 7 foot deep stream that had all kinds of things going in it, and sometimes it would be 3 feet and sometimes it would be 15 feet, they dammed it and made it always 4 feet. And you have a nice source of water here that you can get and you can use anytime you want to, and you don't have to worry about the flooding downstream that would happen during a rainstorm during the seasons, because you're holding back all that water. The problem with that comes with what happens when there is a hurricane that drops 12 inches of rain over the entirety of Eastern North Carolina in an evening. Well, you fill up your reservoir, and you don't want to flood Wilson, so what do? You flip the switch to let all that water be released from the dams, and all at once, all that water from upstream comes flying towards Grifton, and you end up taking this little curve here, and instead of it being a nice pretty curve, create a nice wide river there. And then anybody who had any type of house or anything that's in this curve, just to give you a little hint here, you know, Mr. Salibi lives right there. Okay, so, you know, I know people, Highway 55 is right here. Well, actually, Highway 55 is right here, I'm sorry, on the other side of that line. Grifton School is right here. Okay, if you look at the 99 flood, instead of this red line like this, it was more like this. You know, you could go down Queen Street on a boat in 1999. Okay, and you had a little bit of water up here at the edges, but you could go, it didn't quite reach the school, but you could see the water from the school. And so let's go back to the point of me bringing all this up. After 1999, somehow, some way, I'm not sure if it was the county, I'm not sure if it was private, I'm not sure if it was the state, whatever, but somebody somewhere took this land right here on either side of Highway 11 and either side of Highland Avenue and clear cut it. So this is on Highway 11 going down, and it's hard to see because of you always leave one line of trees so that you don't see all the stuff behind it. But you ended up clear cutting this entire tract of land here. Go back to normal. No, go back. X. But you can kind of tell it here in this swampy area here. When I was in high school, when I was in 10th, 11th, 12th grade, this was a forest. It was a swamp. It would flood every once in a while, but for the most part, it was a forest. And they came in here, and from the highway all the way, like I said, Mr. Salibi's house, all the way to Highland Avenue on either side, they went in there with these giant trucks, and they took all the trees away. Well, then 3 years later, 4 years later, you get another hurricane, what happens in Grifton? Floods just as bad, if not a little bit worse. And it's a little bit quicker. We didn't have the length of time with water because the water just came up and left, but you didn't have the protection that all of these trees provided. All of these trees provided this protection for Grifton for years and years and years. And it didn't do any good in 1999 because that was the 100-year flood, okay? But since 1999, Grifton has flooded 3 more times because of the removal of these trees. Now, would it have happened a little bit without the removal of trees? Maybe. Am I being an alarmist? Environmental science teacher? Quite possibly. But I know what trees do for us. And I know that regardless of the money that got made by selling those trees, the protection Grifton was garnered by them was removed. Okay? We'll preach a little sermon there for you. I preached so hard, Noah left. Noah's like, I ain't tired of hearing this crap. All right. So yeah, some other things about clear cutting. We already mentioned those things, so let's keep on rolling. Come on, computer. What'd you do? I blame Noah. All right, so looking at some other, there's a picture of a landslide. Luckily, we don't have much elevation in North Carolina, but in areas where you do, especially when you have a whole bunch of elevations really close together, like in your tectonic areas, places like California, Oregon, Washington, Central America, Western Mexico, where you have a whole lot of elevation change really close together and really close to water, you can end up with these mudslides that can be devastating because of the clear cutting, because of the removal of trees. And then, you know, once they remove trees, well, okay, what's the company here in Eastern North Carolina that's removing the trees? You got a plant right there. You can see the plant from the baseball field. Nobody knows the brand and the name of the road behind the school. Warehouse? Yeah, it's Warehouse. Warehouse right here in our backyards, quite literally in our backyards, which I've always thought was quite funny. That if you look at the sign, it's the Greenville Lumber Facility, but then the sign says Aiken, North Carolina, and the address is Grifton. So it kind of just shows you who's important, I guess. But that's beside the point. So Weyerhaeuser pays you all kinds of money to come get you trees. Once they get you trees, they offer you your next step, which is, can we start a tree plantation? And you see these around here. There's one right on this side of the Weyerhaeuser facility where you have these rows of pine trees planted down the ways. Now, that's good if that's what you're looking for, but then it also brings out some interesting problems because Weyerhaeuser will brag that they plant 2 trees for every 1 tree they cut down. And I'm sure that if you look at the statistics, that's probably pretty close to true. But it ain't the same. When you cut down an old growth forest in Eastern North Carolina, the work that it's doing for you versus a pine forest planted in rows that is a monoculture, it doesn't approach the same amount of green power that a normal non-human touched forest does for you. Lowers your biodiversity. We all know that. It's something we've talked about over and over again in this class. Less diversity means less species, means a less healthy ecosystem, means it's harder to keep it going. It is much easier for a diverse forest to grow than for a monoculture tree plantation to grow. And you all get the same age too, which means that once they hit that harvesting age, you enter this cycle again of cutting them all back again, and you end up with leaf litter that doesn't get balanced. You end up with all kinds of stuff that just doesn't doesn't work with nature. So what do the forests do for us? They filter out our air pollutants. They remove carbon dioxide and they store carbon dioxide. They act as carbon dioxide reservoirs. If the carbon dioxide is not in a tree, it's in the air. If it's in the air, it's affecting your greenhouse gases.
So the thing from the slide before about like the same age of all the trees would be the same age and stuff, didn't you fix that by like cutting down like part of it, planting some, and then letting these grow at a different rate than these? So you'd be harvesting them, but you'd also have something like that matter that you can, or like not taking every single tree, taking like every other tree.
And you see a little bit of that. Like you will see where rarely do you have a company that like literally clear cuts and leaves nothing behind. Most of the time you'll have, you know, even a clear cut field, you'll see 5 to 10% of the trees left, which is that part of that strategy. The problem with this row's 5 years old and this row's 10 years old is the labor it takes to do that.
So it's like a money thing less than an environmental issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Same reason why they wouldn't do like different species of trees, like they would just do the same because they use them for different things.
And you can, you know, if I'm planting all this species, I know this will be ready to harvest in this many years, whereas you won't have to worry about back and forth.
So for a system like that, where you'd have to have a lot more land than what they currently use, like the current size, for it to be profitable.
I mean, if I had a Weyerhaeuser dude in here right now, and I'm not trying to be offensive to Weyerhaeuser, they do a lot of great things. They would claim that, and I don't want to put words in their mouth. This is the most efficient way to get the most trees and getting trees. I mean, it's like, you know, the Mr. Beast thing. We're planting 1 million trees, you know, and say what type of trees, they didn't say where, you know. This is the most efficient ways to get trees in the ground, and getting trees in the ground solves our problems. There's some truth to that. Okay. not the same as having an old growth forest. All right, and then also trees are, well, just showing you how trees help with pollution, how trees scrub out pollution with their stomata. One of the big movements in environmental science and environmental management is biomimicry, because scientists are realizing that, you know, we're building these machines to do these really complicated processes from scratch. We're working in a lab to try to figure out what we need to do, and the engineer is saying, okay, well, this is what we need to do. We take this, and build this, and then we go look out the window, and a plant has been doing it for the past billion years without all of these complicated technologies. So maybe instead of working and building something from scratch, we can mimic what these organisms have already been doing and come up with a much better solution. You think about the spider web. You know, a spider is able to make thread that is pound for pound stronger than steel inside of its gullet, you know, inside of its cloaca. And you know, without having to, you know, if you ever seen a steel mill, you know, it's all kinds of really, really hot things, boiling this metal and moving things around and mixing these different metals. Whereas the spider's just, you know, eating things and making thread. So it's kind of just an interesting little thing there. So yeah, increase your biodiversity.
Is that what Spider-Man can?
What do you say?
Is that what Spider-Man can swing really good?
Yeah, because he got that really strong thread. Absolutely. Although in the original story of Spider-Man, he actually made his web shooters.
Yeah.
I think actually, did they change that back for
Yeah, they
Amazing?
changed it back for
Okay. But yeah, sure. All right, so deforestation, what does it do? Get more carbon dioxide in the air. That's the simplest, easiest thing. You want global warming to happen, go cut down a forest, because you're not only using mechanisms to put carbon dioxide in the air, but you're also cutting down the things that are going to take carbon dioxide out of the air. Slash and burn is even worse, because not only are you cutting the trees down, but then you burn them. That releases even more carbon dioxide into the air and causes all kinds of greenhouse gases and things like that. Not so much slash and burn around here, but every once in a while you will see some slash and burn to clear out some land. We'll say green revolution real quick, because we've already kind of mentioned it and we talk about it a lot with agriculture. First off, the green revolution is good in the fact that we have enough food to support 7 billion people. So let's go ahead and get that out of the way. You know, I'm not this preacher up here talking about how we should go back to eating berries and nuts and following the wildebeest across the field. Okay. The green revolution is what allows us to have our modern culture that we have today, and allows us to have 7 billion people on the planet. The question is, how do we do it in a sustainable way, so that, and in an equitable way, so that we don't end up with these, you know, tragedies happening all over the world, and so that you don't end up with a human population crash due to catastrophic change. So what happened for the green revolution? So it's industrial scale agribusiness. We're pretty much talking industrial revolution right after the industrial revolution. Increased mechanizations, genetically modified organisms, another thing that I am not going to talk crap about, because genetically modified organisms allow us to do all kinds of things in more sustainable ways. So the question with GMOs becomes not what are we doing to the environment? The question becomes, what long-term effects does that have on living things? And we just don't know. From an environmental standpoint, GMOs are great, because they allow us to do things in cleaner ways, but we just don't know what that means. You start messing with genes, you can get all kinds of things going on. Irrigation and fertilizers and pesticides. It greatly increases the efficiency of land. So you went from 2,000 years ago, native people in Grifton growing corn, where they could probably grow a certain amount of corn on a certain amount of land. If you compared it to the amount of corn that is grown behind my house this summer, it would probably be 50 times more efficient now, because you can grow so many crops so much closer together in a much cheaper way to feed way more people. Even though what's wild is that you could walk in the native people's cornfield 1,000 years ago, grab an ear of corn and have a meal, and you can walk in the cornfield behind my house this summer and be disgusted and not be able to eat it. Because the corn that's grown around here is not grown for human consumption. It's grown to make chemicals, corn syrup, or feed livestock so that you can have a dollar McChicken.
Hi.
What's up?
So like the crops that we grow to feed animals and the crops that we grow like to feed ourselves, what's the problem with just making like using the same crop? Or is it just cheaper to make one for the animals that way?
Because yellow dent number 2 tastes like crap. And cows don't care.
Because I was gonna say
But doesn't that change the taste of the meat as well?
You can make an argument. I mean, certainly people who are growing grass-fed beef absolutely will make that argument. That the quality of beef that you get from corn-fed, grain-fed beef versus the quality of beef that you get from grass-fed, grazing beef is very, very different.
It's the same with
What'd you
the-
say?
depending on the land that you're on.
Yep.
it'll taste different. Each
I was-
season's better.
I was gonna say, because if we just started the same thing that we ate, wouldn't we need like not less this, because I guess you'd still have the same amount of organisms to feed, but you wouldn't need to like separate your fields as much and you could just grow.
The reason that they chose yellow dent number 2 is because of how much they can grow for the price. Like you can grow sweet corn quite efficiently in Eastern North Carolina, but it's nowhere near the efficiency of the yellow dent number 2.
So it just doesn't grow fast enough for them.
It doesn't grow fast enough. You don't get the yield is nowhere near as much. You can't plant them as close together. I'm sure that if I had a farmer here, they would tell me a couple more reasons.
So did you say that's like a eugenics type thing of like the way we like bred cows, like so that they eat the way that they do? Because like I feel like cows naturally like wild, not wild cows, because you don't see that, but like wild bulls and stuff like that, they don't eat. Obviously, they don't eat the same things as like domesticated cows. So would you say that like there's no way for us to just change their diet so it wouldn't need to eat as much or something like that?
I mean, it's not about eating as much. It's about eating cheaper. It's like we haven't bred cows to eat less. We've bred cows to. It's not necessarily that we bred them. It's that we've only allowed them to eat this certain thing.
They've gotten used to eating less quality.
And so it's a matter of feeding the cows for cheaper.
So it's just all about money.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
the
like-
world go around. I mean, that's. I mean, if we had to support 7 billion people on pre-Green Revolution technology, people would have to die. And so it's not necessarily. I don't mean to make it this, Mr. Burns, evil thing when I say it's all about money. It's about being able to do what you need to do to keep people alive. And so, how do we get to different things? That's what we're going to talk about. That's where we're kind of going to get going forward. So soil erosion, biodiversity loss, we already talked about that a bunch. And then ground and surface water contamination. I think that might be pretty close to being to the end here. Mechanization is huge, big change in the way farm works. It's a way that you can go from a field that would have taken 50 to 100 people to tend 150 years ago, and 3 people can do it now. I mean, it's a way that you can just shift an entire society when it comes to those types of things. It's good in the fact that you have 47 to 97 people who can go and do something different, but then the question comes, well, what do they do? And do they do something that helps the environmental problems that are happening because of this or hurts them? All right, so we'll stop there because I told you 11:10 and I'm trying to keep a good eye on the clock here. And we'll jump back in this tomorrow. Don't forget that you have, like I said, AP classroom test, unit 4 test, that is closing tonight. I will probably check it later this evening and see how we're doing, and I might extend the deadline if we need to, because I don't want to, because it's a pain in the butt once it closes to reopen it. I'm not even sure I can, but I'll look at it. Knock that out.
Wait, how long ago was that test?
Last Wednesday, but I don't think you did. Yeah, it's actually right here.
The APID test won't close out.
APID test is not going to close.
I think it was Friday though.
But I had said I'd like for it to be Friday, but there's no hard close for it like there is for the AP classroom
So
test.
APID test isn't due till Friday.
Have you
it's not
graded
this time.
any of the API tests?
Unit 4 test, if you turned it in, I graded up. No, I have not graded it because I graded the ones people were turning in late. I'm gonna close the Zoom. AP, you got any questions?
No.
All right, I missed you today.